The material you brought for us today covers what has to be one of the most, well, one of the most profound and systemic miscarriages of justice in modern British history.
It really is. We're talking about the wrongful convictions of the Guildford Four and the Maguire Seven back in the 1970s.
A story that should really serve as a permanent, chilling case study.
It should, and our purpose today is to do an analytical exploration of this whole complex narrative. We're using your sources to try and understand the reality of what happened, the bombings, the deeply flawed investigations that followed.
And the years of imprisonment.
The years of imprisonment, and maybe most critically, the almost total lack of accountability for the institutions that were responsible for this failure.
This whole exploration, it's really a study in how critical facts that prove innocence, can be deliberately suppressed.
Yes, for political and institutional convenience, we want to understand the mechanism behind that failure.
Okay, so before we get into the details, let's just establish the timeline for everyone. We're focused on the immediate aftermath of the horrific Guildford pub bombings in October 1974.
That attack killed 5 people, and it was followed by the Woolwich pub bombing in November 1974, which killed 2 more.
And the state needed convictions, and fast.
Exactly. So the Guildford Four were convicted in October of 1975 for these provisional IRA attacks. And then the institutional fallout from that first flawed investigation, it just snowballed.
Leading to the second tragedy.
Yes, the Maguire Seven. They were convicted less than 6 months later, in March of 1976.
And the length of time they spent in prison, it just underscores how monumental the challenge is when you're trying to fight against institutional wrongdoing.
It's staggering. The 4 served 14 years before their convictions were finally overturned in 1989.
And the 7.
They had to wait even longer, until 1991, for their names to be cleared. So you're talking about 15, 16 years of freedom stolen from them.
That length of time, it speaks volumes, doesn't it? About the climate of fear and the legal scaffolding that was in place.
It does. I mean, the sweeping anti-terrorism legislation at the time made securing these convictions relatively easy and overturning them nearly impossible. The system was, in a sense, designed to protect its own original judgment, not to correct its errors.
So to understand why, we have to go back to the very foundation of the case against the Guildford Four.
That's where it all begins.
Okay, let's unpack that first stage of this legal tragedy.
Yeah.
Who exactly were the Guildford Four, and what was the state's case against them?
The Guildford Four were Paul Michael Hill, Jerry Conlon, Patrick Joseph Armstrong, known as Patty and Carol Richardson.
And they're young.
Very young. When they were arrested, Hill and Conlon were 21, Armstrong was 25. And Carol Richardson was extraordinarily young. She was only 17 at the time of the bombings.
Just a teenager. And the charges were as serious as they get.
They were. All 4 were convicted of involvement in the bombings, which legally meant they were convicted of murder. And Paul Hill was also separately convicted for the murder of a British soldier, Brian Shaw, a charge that also came out of that same period of police custody.
And the entire case, the foundational pillar holding up the whole prosecution, it rested solely on self-incrimination, didn't it?
It did. The state had no independent forensic evidence, nothing tying them to the explosive devices, nothing tying them to the crime scenes.
So that's the essential vulnerability of the case right there.
It is. The only evidence was the confessions, and these confessions were obtained under the most severe conditions imaginable.
So all 4 defendants confessed during this intense police interrogation.
They did. And while they retracted those confessions almost immediately and maintained their innocence throughout their entire imprisonment, the jury believed the police testimony. They found the confessions credible.
Let's talk about what happened inside those interrogation rooms. The sources detail some harrowing allegations of coercion and, well, physical abuse.
The accounts are brutal. The allegations that came out after their retractions, they paint a picture of physical violence, of relentless psychological intimidation, and explicit threats made against their family members.
So the Surrey police were using tactics designed to just break them down.
Absolutely, holding them in uncomfortable or vulnerable positions for hours on end. Jerry Conlon specifically detailed how police officers would lie to him about the health of his father, Giuseppe, or say he was also in detention, just to leverage that emotional distress.
And the sources also point out a critical element here that the police exploited, which was drug withdrawal.
That's right. Both Patty Armstrong and Carol Richardson were known users of drugs. The sudden, enforced withdrawal in custody just compounded all the physical and mental stress of the interrogation.
So that state of severe physical disorientation and pain would have made them incredibly vulnerable.
Significantly more vulnerable to the coercion tactics the police were using. I mean, a person experiencing acute drug withdrawal is highly unlikely to be thinking clearly enough to withstand that kind of sustained aggressive questioning, let alone protect themselves from fabricated admissions.
And Jerry Conlon himself, he later wrote about the specific legal detail that enabled all this.
He did, and this is a crucial point about the legal context of the time. He identified the Prevention of Terrorism Act of 1974.
And what did that change?
Well, before this act, the police had to adhere to the old judge's rules, which were administrative guidelines designed to protect suspects. They mandated that police had to caution suspects, that questioning should be recorded, detention had to be reasonable.
But the new anti-terrorism laws changed all that.
They changed everything. They allowed the police to hold suspects without charge for up to a week, 7 days.
And why was that 7-day detention rule so devastating?
Conlon argued that if the standard 48-hour detention limit had been in effect, he might have been able to withstand the abuse. But 7 days. That allowed the interrogators to operate a continuous cycle of degradation and exhaustion.
It essentially sanctioned psychological torture.
It did. It stretched their resolve until they were willing to sign anything at all, just for a moment of relief. So the duration of the detention became a central mechanism for manufacturing false evidence.
Beyond the coercion, though, the profiles of the four themselves should have been a massive red flag to anyone investigating the highly organized, disciplined, provisional IRA.
Absolutely. The sources show a clear lack of, suitability for hardened IRA operatives. Patty Armstrong and Carol Richardson were living in a squat. They were involved with drugs and minor property crimes.
They were marginalized individuals, not revolutionary foot soldiers.
Exactly. And Jerry Conlon's background was similar. He asserted in his autobiography that the IRA would have actively rejected him because of his record of petty crime. He specifically mentioned shoplifting.
He even claimed he was expelled from a Republican youth group for that reason.
He did. Fiona Ariane, he said the organization needed to maintain a disciplined image, and his history just undermined that.
So to suggest that these individuals, who were described as disorganized, petty criminals, were somehow capable of executing these complex, coordinated, deadly bombings, it just defies logic.
It really does. It suggests the investigation prioritized securing a conviction, any conviction, to reassure a panicking public and political establishment rather than pursuing the true perpetrators.
And once the police had their suspects and their coerced confessions, the legal machinery just moved forward with terrifying speed.
And with terrifying prejudice.
And you can see that prejudice so clearly in the attitude of the trial judge, Lord Donaldson of Leamington. His judicial opinion is one of the most chilling things in the source material.
It is. The mandatory life sentence for murder was already severe, but Lord Donaldson's comments went far, far beyond his required legal duty. He openly expressed profound regret that the four had not been charged with high treason.
High treason, which at that time still technically carried the death penalty.
It did. Executions hadn't happened since 1964, but it was still on the books. This was a statement of extraordinary judicial bias. He was injecting political vengeance directly into the courtroom.
It was more than a statement, though. He took steps to ensure they would never see freedom.
He did. The usual procedure for life sentences was to let the Home Secretary handle parole recommendations down the line. But Lord Donaldson felt compelled to act. He stated that he expected to be dead by the time any future release was considered, and so he took it upon himself to recommend extraordinarily long minimum terms.
What were they?
He recommended 30 years for Jerry Conlon, 35 for Patty Armstrong, and for Paul Hill, he recommended imprisonment until great age.
These were effectively death sentences.
Delivered indirectly, yes. They were designed to ensure they would perish within the prison system. And this established an official narrative of absolute guilt that proved almost impossible to dismantle for the next 14, 15 years.
And that initial judicial decision, it just set the stage for the next institutional failure, which spiraled out and led directly to the conviction of the Maguire Seven.
This is where the concept of guilt by association becomes just devastatingly clear.
As a chain reaction.
Fueled by fear and paranoia. The immediate link was Jerry Conlon's father, Patrick, who was known as Giuseppe, a good man. He traveled from Belfast to London specifically to try and help his son after the arrest.
And this simple, loyal act of a father trying to support his son tragically put him and his entire extended family right in the crosshairs of the investigation.
That's right.
Now, the charges against the Maguire Seven were different from the four. They weren't accused of planting the bombs themselves.
No, they were convicted of possessing nitroglycerin, which the police alleged they were handling and passing to the IRA for the manufacture of bombs.
And this allegation came after a police raid in December 1974.
Yes, on the home of Anne Maguire, who was Jerry Conlon's aunt, in West Kilburn. The police claimed to have found traces of the explosive on the hands of 7 people in the house, which was a crucial piece of scientific evidence that would later become highly, highly controversial.
Just reading the list of who was convicted, the sheer family impact of this raid is devastating. It wasn't just adults.
No, it was children, too. The net was cast incredibly wide. The 7 included Anne Maguire, who was 40, and her husband Patrick Sr., who was 42.
And their 2 young sons were caught up in it.
They were. Vincent, who was 17, and Patrick Jr., who was tragically only 14 years old.
14.
Also implicated were Anne's brother Sean Smith, a family friend Patrick O'Neill, and of course the visitor, 52-year-old Giuseppe Conlon.
To arrest, charge, and then successfully convict a 14-year-old boy in an anti-terrorism case based on this kind of flawed evidence.
Yeah.
It's just horrifying.
And the courts showed no leniency, despite the questionable evidence. The sentences reflected the political climate, which was defined by this unquestioning belief in the state's narrative and a deep anti-Irish prejudice.
What were the sentences?
Anne and Patrick Sr. received 14 years in prison. Sean Smith and Patrick O'Neill got 12 years. And even the 2 teenage sons were handed down punitive sentences.
What did they get?
Vincent, the 17-year-old, got 5 years. And the youngest, Patrick Jr., at 14 years old, received 4 years.
4 years for a 14-year-old boy.
Yeah.
Convicted of helping the IRA based on traces of a chemical the police claimed to find on him.
It was a horrific destruction of a family unit based on evidence that was, at best, inconclusive and, at worst, scientifically corrupted. But the greatest tragedy was reserved for Giuseppe Conlon.
He was already ill when he was sentenced.
He was. He was suffering from lung troubles, including tuberculosis, when he was sentenced to 12 years. He went to prison solely because he was loyal to his son.
And he didn't survive to see his name cleared.
That's right. Giuseppe Conlon died in prison in January 1980, less than 4 years into his sentence. An innocent man who came to England to offer support, only to be branded a terrorist and sentenced to die in a prison hospital.
His death became such a powerful, painful symbol of the ultimate cost of this state failure.
It did. The system failed him while he was alive, and it failed him even in death, as his name remained legally tainted for another decade.
This immediate and devastating rupture within these families, the father's death, the conviction of children, it just compounds the trauma. They all knew they were innocent.
And yet they were facing these sentences that guaranteed years, if not decades, of their lives were just gone. That shared sense of knowing the truth while battling a monolithic system that refused to even acknowledge the possibility of error is what defined their struggle for the next decade and a half.
Which sets the stage for that decades-long fight for exoneration. And this was not a quick reversal. This was a war against a justice system that was fundamentally designed to protect the integrity of its own initial convictions.
Indeed. The immediate appeals sought by both the Guildford Four and the Maguire Seven were refused, sometimes with breathtaking speed. And what makes this refusal so shocking is that the system was given an immediate, clear opportunity to correct itself.
And it chose not to.
It emphatically chose not to.
You're referring to the intervention of the real perpetrators. This is where the institutional resistance moves from simple error to, well, active obstruction.
Precisely. In February 1977, so less than 2 years after the 4 were convicted, the real IRA bombers, the Balcombe Street Active Service Unit, or ASU, were on trial for a different series of bombings.
During their trial, they instructed their lawyers to make a dramatic public statement.
They did. The ASU instructed their lawyers to publicly draw attention to the fact that 4 totally innocent people were serving massive sentences.
So they confessed.
They openly confessed to carrying out the Guildford and Woolwich bombings, providing details that should have immediately cast serious doubt on the convictions of the 4.
So let me get this straight. The actual perpetrators confessed in open court, yet the state refused to charge them with these specific offenses. And the Guildford Four remained in prison for another 12 years.
That's what happened.
How could the system possibly justify ignoring a confession from the actual terrorists?
The inertia was rooted in politics and, frankly, pride. Accepting the Balcombe Street confession would have forced the police and the director of public prosecutions to admit 2 deeply inconvenient truths.
Which were?
First, that their expensive, politically charged investigation was a catastrophic failure. And second, that their own officers had coerced confessions and committed perjury. The political cost of admitting that, during the height of the Troubles, was deemed too high.
And the Home Office memoranda from that era, which the sources mentioned, they're particularly revealing about this mindset.
They are. There were internal Home Office communications even as late as 1987 that recognized it was unlikely the Guildford Four were actually terrorists. But these same memos concluded that this doubt alone was not enough to allow a new appeal.
So the burden of proof to overturn a conviction was set impossibly high.
It was. It prioritized preserving public confidence in the judicial process over the liberty of four innocent people. The system had created this immovable object, the official conviction, and no amount of external force, not even the real bomber's confession, could shift it.
So it took years of campaigning by, as the sources put it, lone voices.
Yes, journalists and advocates to maintain pressure. We have to recognize the dedication of figures like David Martin, Gavin Esler, Chris Mullen, and David McKittrick, who consistently reported on the inconsistencies.
And media exposure was critical, too. The sources mention a 1980 BBC documentary.
Yes, Spotlight, Giuseppe Conlon and the Bomb Factory. That documentary played a crucial role in injecting the human element, Giuseppe's death, the imprisoned teenagers, back into the public consciousness. It helped elevate the Maguire case from a complex legal fight to a profound moral outrage.
But the real turning point didn't come until 1989.
That's right. An independent investigation by Avon and Somerset Constabulary was initiated. And this time, the focus wasn't on the bombs, it was on the police duplicity.
This is where the foundation of the original conviction really starts to crumble.
It is. The Avon and Somerset detectives were tasked with investigating how the Surrey police handled the Four's statements, and they unearthed significant evidence that had been either deliberately concealed or outright fabricated.
Let's detail those specific improprieties, the ones that proved the whole case was a lie, starting with the interview notes.
Okay, so the key findings revealed that the Surrey police had fabricated evidence after the fact. They found that the typed notes from Paddy Armstrong's police interviews, which were presented in court as genuine, contemporaneous records, had been extensively and suspiciously edited.
Edited how?
They showed clear deletions, additions, rearrangements of text. The documents submitted to the court were not what they purported to be.
Not at all.
Crucially, the investigators determined that these notes were consistent with handwritten and typed versions that were made after the interviews had concluded.
So the police manufactured a narrative to fit their case long after the fact.
And then presented this fabricated narrative under oath as a genuine, real-time record. It's a monumental breach of judicial ethics.
What other specific pieces of evidence were uncovered?
A second massive finding concerned Paul Hill's interrogation. They discovered manuscript notes related to his interview, which had been deliberately withheld from the Director of Public Prosecutions and the defense.
And what did these notes show?
They revealed that Hill's crucial fifth statement was taken in explicit breach of the judge's rules, the established protocol designed to protect suspects from undue pressure.
So if the interview was taken in breach of the rules, that statement should have been inadmissible in court.
Precisely. And the officers involved had denied under oath that such an interview had even taken place. The discovery of these suppressed notes proved the police had committed perjury to secure and maintain a false confession.
And there was more.
There was. The investigators also found that the police detention records, the basic paperwork documenting when suspects were held when they were interviewed, were inconsistent with the times and durations of the crucial interviews. The entire timeline of the custody period was a bureaucratic deception.
So once this comprehensive pattern of systemic deceit was presented by an external police force, the Crown had no choice.
No choice but to admit that the entire case against the Four was compromised. That acknowledgement came in October 1989 during the appeal hearing. The Crown announced it would no longer seek to support the convictions.
And Lord Chief Justice Lord Lane presided over the quashing of the convictions. What was his final conclusion?
His ones are famous, and they are damning. He stated unequivocally that due to the level of duplicity found, the whole of their evidence becomes suspect, and, I repeat, on their evidence depended the prosecution case.
He declared the convictions unsafe.
He did, which led to the immediate release of Paul Hill, Jerry Conlon, Paddy Armstrong, and Carol Richardson. The most profound revelation of that day wasn't their innocence, but the documented guilt of the state's agents.
We should also mention that Paul Hill's other conviction for the murder of soldier Brian Shaw, which came from a confession during that same heated custody period, took even longer to overturn.
A painful demonstration of how deeply ingrained the false narrative had become. It wasn't until 1994, 5 years later, that it was finally quashed.
And the next step was the exoneration of the Maguire Seven in 1991, following the findings of the Sir John May judicial inquiry.
That's right.
What specific failures did the May inquiry highlight for the Maguires? Their case was more about forensic science than confessions.
The May inquiry focused critically on that scientific evidence, the claim that traces of nitroglycerin were found on their hands. The inquiry found massive improprieties in how this evidence was handled. The expert testimony used in the original trial was found to be highly flawed and inconclusive.
How?
Critically, the scientific methods they used couldn't definitively distinguish between traces of pure nitroglycerin, the explosive, and traces of common chemicals or contaminants that you could find in any household.
Like soap or certain industrial materials.
Exactly. So the explosive traces were likely just contamination, perhaps even introduced by the police or the forensic scientists themselves.
And the inquiry also criticized the prosecution for another failure of disclosure.
Yes. They had failed to disclose a statement that provided an alibi supporting Jerry Conlon, which naturally would have aided his father, Giuseppe, and his aunt, Anne, by weakening the connection between the two groups.
So once again, it was disclosure failure, the deliberate hiding of information, that was central to overturning the convictions.
It proved that the culture of suppression was widespread. Two groups, two distinct trials, both overturned due to institutional duplicity. It's an appalling record of justice failing at every single step.
A profoundly expensive failure, measured in human lives and stolen years.
Absolutely.
Moving into the aftermath, you find this bitter irony. The real bombers, the Balcombe Street ASU, they were eventually freed under the Good Friday Agreement.
As part of the peace process, yes, having served their life sentences for other crimes. Meanwhile, the innocent families were left to struggle with the profound damage that was inflicted on them.
The contrast is stark. The actual perpetrators gained a political release, while the innocent had to fight tooth and nail just to prove they weren't involved.
And it's important to stress that, despite the convictions being overturned, no one else has ever been charged with the Guildford or Woolwich bombings, nor with supplying the explosive material. It just cements the fact that the state's investigation was a spectacular failure of targeting the wrong people and then refusing to backtrack.
And what about accountability for the state officials who oversaw this? The officers who fabricated notes and committed perjury?
Well, following the successful appeal, 3 British police officers were charged with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice in the Guildford Four case. In 1993, after a trial, all 3 were found not guilty.
That raises a terrifying question about the functionality of the system. You have undeniable judicial findings, from the Lord Chief Justice no less, that police duplicity rendered the convictions unsafe, yet the officers responsible can't be criminally convicted for it. How is that possible?
It speaks to the enormous difficulty in proving criminal intent years after the fact, especially when the institutional establishment, which relies on police cooperation, might be, reluctant to secure such a landmark conviction. So while the courts recognized the deception, the police officers responsible walked free.
The only form of official accountability came much, much later.
A political and moral reckoning decades later. That moral reckoning came in the form of a public apology from Prime Minister Tony Blair in 2005.
He stood before Parliament.
He did, on February 9th, 2005, and delivered a powerful public apology to the families of all 11 people imprisoned. He acknowledged the ordeal and injustice they suffered, stating clearly that they deserve to be completely and publicly exonerated.
But it arrived 30 years after the initial wrongful arrests.
30 years. And 25 years after Giuseppe Conlon had died in prison.
The human cost of those decades is the real story here. Their release marked the end of their legal battle, but it was just the start of a lifelong struggle with trauma.
The long-term impact was severe, and it varied widely. Jerry Conlon, who is probably the most recognizable name, he channeled his suffering into activism. His autobiography, Proved Innocent, became the basis for that powerful 1993 film, In the Name of the Father.
Right, which brought the story to a global audience, even with some fictional liberties.
It did. And Conlon became a prominent, tireless justice campaigner. He frequently spoke about the vulnerability of suspects and the dangers of anti-terrorism laws until his death in 2014.
His family's statement when he died was very powerful.
It was. They said his fight forced the world's closed eyes to be open to injustice. It forced unimaginable wickedness to be acknowledged.
And we should pause to recognize the extraordinary endurance of Jerry's mother, Sarah Conlon. She campaigned relentlessly for 16 years to clear her husband and her son's names.
An incredible woman. She died in 2008, having seen her fight for justice succeed. Looking at the others. Carol Richardson, the youngest of the four, she tried to build a life out of the public eye. She married, had a daughter.
That she died young.
Tragically, yes. She died in 2012 at the age of 55. It's a clear indication that the immense pressure and trauma of her incarceration likely contributed to a shortened life.
And Patty Armstrong. His path sounds equally difficult.
Armstrong suffered severe problems with drinking and gambling after his release. Difficulties often associated with deep-seated trauma and the inability to reintegrate into normal life after such a profound institutional betrayal. He eventually moved to Dublin.
Their lives were just irreversibly altered.
They were. And for the Maguire family, the memory of Giuseppe Conlon dying in prison under a cloud of false accusation forever stains their history.
And their trauma was specific and generational.
It was. Patrick Maguire Jr., who was only 14 when he was imprisoned, he later detailed the profound impact of his incarceration in his autobiography, My Father's Watch. It's a harrowing perspective on how the justice system treats children in politically charged investigations.
And his mother, Anne Maguire.
Despite her ordeal, she found the strength to forgive. She even received the Benemerenti Medal from the Roman Catholic Church for her community work and her remarkable ability to forgive.
It takes an incredible amount of strength to manage that level of forgiveness. The sources reveal one final, frustrating layer to this entire saga: the continued opacity regarding the official records.
This is perhaps the most modern indication that the culture of suppression is still active. Over 700 documents, including secret testimony and internal analysis collected by the Sir John May inquiry.
The one that led to the Maguires' exoneration.
That's the one. Those documents were scheduled to be publicly unsealed in the National Archives on January 1st, 2020.
And what happened?
On December 31st, 2019, the day before they were due for release, the Home Office removed all those documents from the National Archive and took them back into government control. They remain sealed today.
And the rationale was national security.
That was the reason given.
Meaning that vital records, which could shed more light on the institutional processes and political pressures that enabled this entire injustice, are still being kept from the public.
It demonstrates a persistent instinct for secrecy and self-protection, mirroring the deception that started the case back in 1974. The pattern of suppressing facts remains unbroken.
This brings us to the ultimate cynical irony revealed by the sources. The fact that almost every key British figure involved in these wrongful convictions was subsequently promoted
to the highest ranks of their profession. Jerry Conlon himself observed this phenomenon, that the very figures responsible for the institutional failure were celebrated and elevated, contrasting sharply with the victims' struggles.
It suggests that the institutional priority during a political crisis like the Troubles wasn't to uphold justice, but to demonstrate competence and decisiveness by securing convictions, no matter the means.
And once that conviction was secured, the individuals responsible for that politically convenient outcome were rewarded for their loyalty to the established narrative.
Let's examine these career trajectories, starting with Lord Justice Donaldson, the trial judge whose comments were so profoundly biased.
Lord Justice John Donaldson had a remarkable ascent after the trials. In 1979, he was appointed a Lord Justice of Appeal. Then, in 1982, he was appointed to the role of Master of the Rolls.
And for listeners who might not be familiar with the UK judicial system, what does the Master of the Rolls do?
The Master of the Rolls is the second most senior judicial office in England and Wales. It's effectively the head of the civil division of the Court of Appeal, a hugely influential and prestigious position.
So the judge who presided over a case built on coerced confessions and who recommended the defendants die in prison was elevated to the second highest judicial rank in the country.
That's right. And he was further elevated in 1988 to the House of Lords as a life peer. And there's that stunning irony regarding his legal legacy.
Yes, tell us about that.
The appeal case concerning the Maguire Seven, R.V. Maguire 1981, which Donaldson presided over, has since become cited as the leading legal precedent in the UK for disclosure to the defense.
So the very figure involved in a case defined by the deliberate failure to disclose exonerating evidence left behind a legacy that's supposed to champion the opposite principle.
It's a clear example of the system absorbing its controversial figures and repurposing them, demonstrating that institutional status takes precedence over documented failure.
Now let's look at the police side, focusing on Sir Peter Imbert.
Sir Peter Imbert was a central figure. He was deputy head of the Met's anti-terrorist branch when the Guildford Four and Maguire Seven were arrested and interrogated. The investigation he oversaw was later described by the Lord Chief Justice as a sequence of false confessions and police deceits.
And crucially, in late 1975, he led the operation that arrested the Balcombe Street ASU.
He did, meaning he personally knew that the real IRA bombers had confessed to the Guildford and Woolwich crimes, thereby confirming the innocence of the four.
He had undeniable knowledge of the truth.
And yet the innocent remained in jail for over a decade while his career skyrocketed. The promotions began immediately. He was appointed Assistant Chief Constable and then Deputy Chief Constable of Surrey Constabulary.
The very force that carried out the tainted investigation.
The very same. By 1979, he was Chief Constable of Thames Valley Police.
And his rise culminated at the absolute pinnacle of British policing.
It did. In 1987, Imbert was appointed Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. That's the senior-most police position in the entire United Kingdom. He held that post until 1992, receiving a knighthood and eventually a life peerage.
So his career path suggests that protecting the state's narrative during a time of crisis was viewed as exemplary service,
overriding the ethical failures of his earlier work.
We also have to examine the legal counsel who prosecuted these cases, Lord Michael Havers.
Havers led the prosecution for both the Guildford Four and the Maguire Seven, and he continued his involvement by leading the Crown's case in opposing their subsequent appeals.
Appeals that were happening even as suppressed evidence, like the Balcombe Street confessions, was festering in government files.
Exactly. And while there's no public source proving he personally knew about every suppressed document, his role as the leading prosecutor who continuously fought to keep these innocent people imprisoned is undeniable.
And his promotion was immediate and politically significant.
Havers was a key figure in the Conservative Party. Following the convictions, he was reappointed Attorney General for England and Wales in 1979. He was even included in Margaret Thatcher's war cabinet during the Falklands War.
And what was his ultimate judicial promotion?
After retiring from the House of Commons, Thatcher appointed him Lord Chancellor in 1987.
Lord Chancellor. That's historically the most senior judicial office holder in the UK.
It is. A major minister of the Crown and the presiding officer of the House of Lords. So again, a central architect of the state's failed prosecution was elevated to the single most senior judicial office.
Finally, let's consider Sir Norman Skelhorn, the Director of Public Prosecutions, who oversaw the strategy for all these cases.
Skelhorn's influence is critical because he really set the tone for the state's approach to Irish terror suspects. The sources highlight a highly controversial public comment he made in October 1973 at the Harvard Law School Forum.
This was when he was questioned about allegations of torture being used in Northern Ireland.
Yes, and he didn't deny the practice. On the contrary, he offered a justification.
What did he say?
He stated explicitly that when dealing with Irish terrorists, any methods were justified.
A truly alarming public statement from the highest prosecution official in the UK.
It essentially provided a chilling ideological license for the compromised investigations, the suppressed evidence, and the severe abuse of process that characterized all these cases. He effectively signaled that the political goal of getting a conviction outweighed adhering to fundamental legal rules or judicial honesty.
Sir Norman Skelhorn retired in 1977, so he managed to avoid the direct official fallout. But his legacy is inextricably linked to this era of state malpractice.
The common thread linking Donaldson, Imbert, Havers, and Skelhorn is profoundly disturbing. Their proximity to a politically urgent, high-profile, and deeply flawed investigation did not derail or even slow their careers. It demonstrably accelerated them.
It confirms Jerry Conlon's observation that institutional failure wasn't penalized, it was rewarded.
Because it demonstrated loyalty and decisiveness when the establishment demanded it most.
We have completed a comprehensive review of the definitive evidence of one of the UK's most severe miscarriages of justice. We've noted the suppressed evidence, the police deception, the profound family trauma, and the eventual exoneration, which was often forced by outside campaigners.
The long arc of this story reveals a system that was incredibly effective at securing convictions under pressure, tragically ineffective at self-correction, and highly efficient at protecting its own high-ranking officials.
The depth of institutional self-interest exposed here is immense. The officials responsible for failing to convict the guilty and wrongfully convicting the innocent were subsequently elevated to the highest positions of power.
The very people who presided over the deceit were made guardians of integrity.
So if the system's primary instinct is not to truly correct itself, but to preserve its own image and elevate its loyalists, what does that ultimately suggest about the true function of justice when it's placed under extreme political pressure?
It's a question that even with those 700 vital documents remaining sealed by the state, continues to resonate today. A deeply unsettling thought for anyone concerned with the rule of law.
Thank you for walking us through this profoundly important and difficult material, and for providing all the necessary context and detail.
It was necessary to cover this in depth.
And to you, thanks for listening.